Hey guys, welcome back to another video. So the kind people at Arrtx once again have sent me another set of acrylic markers for me to test out and show you guys. So I have used their smaller set. Let me actually go grab it. So I've used this set in particular, which is their 24 colored Simptap markers. And these are one of my favorites, and I'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later. So let's go ahead and check out this one. Not only that, the colors for this is so cute. Packaging wise, kind of reminds me of like a little bit of watermelon, but like pastel. So this is the 48 color set, so we have doubled in colors, and you can kind of see the swatches on the back. But let's take a look inside. So we have this little strap to keep everything nice and closed. We are greeted by all the markers. So these ones in particular are a little bit different. I am probably also going to sort them most likely, and we'll do swatches. So I don't know if I've shown you guys the close-up of these markers, probably in the previous video, but these ones are brush tip. So this is kind of like one of the reasons I love these markers so much, is because they are a brush tip. They also have like a very fine sharp point, which I really like using for line art. So I will show you guys some quick examples of like how I've used them, and then we'll jump in to do our swatches of all these lovely colors. I know people have been asking for me to add Auroron to this particular like little Genshin portrait set that I did of like our Natlan trio. So I have Mualani, we have Kinich, and we have Kachina. But the one marker that was kind of like consistent all across the board was me using the Simptap markers to do the line art. And you can kind of see how nice and crisp the lines are. So it's mostly like this black I'm using, some of this dark purple. In Kinich, I used mostly the black, I believe. And then for Kachina, I did a mixture of black, we have a little bit of blue, and then I used kind of like a purple for a softer look. And they're just very easy to work with if you want to have like sharper, thinner lines. So yeah, let's go ahead and do something similar-ish to these in terms of like, I will be using another canvas linen painting board thing, but we're not going to be doing the same orientation of the square, nor will we be doing a Genshin character. So we'll get into swatches first though. Okay, we're not going to talk about how many mistakes I made during this portion where I was trying to do all the swatches. I was going to have it all mapped out, but I ended up putting the numbers above the colors instead of below, and usually I work with it below, so there's going to be a few colors that are off, and I'm going to have to cover them up a little bit later. But I will be doing the rest of this video in voiceover just because I filmed everything kind of like inconsistently, and I forgot to turn on my mic for certain portions, so it'd just be easier this way. But while I do the swatches, let's talk about how to activate these markers. So the Simptap markers are the type that are, I guess like you have a metal ball in the center of the barrel, which helps you mix up the paint. So just in case you get separation or anything like that. So to prep your pen, you're going to shake first and make sure your pen is all nice and mixed up. We're going to take off the end cap, and on the other side of the pen, it has like this protective cap. Once you remove that, you can go ahead and press down and watch all the paint kind of like go from the barrel to the tip of your pen. So for these markers, they do have kind of like this foamy kind of sharp felt tip. I guess it's not felt, it's kind of like a foam, not quite like brush hairs by any means. But that's kind of like how you get all your markers kind of prepped. I also recommend that if you let your markers sit for a little while, always like preemptively shake them to make sure you're mixing the paint once again inside the barrel. But with that out of the way, we have all of our color selections here, or color swatches. So I was lucky that the markers are opaque enough for me to cover up some of my mistakes where I placed the wrong color into the wrong portion. But as you can see, it has a pretty good selection of colors. I do wish there was slightly more variation in our blues and purples, but we'll talk about that a little bit later once we start working on our piece. So I did some sketches in my sketchbook of Anaxa from Honkai Star Rail because I already knew there was going to be kind of like this sea foam green color that I really wanted to work with, and I always like pairing that up with usually like a vibrant red. We could go with a coral color or even orange, or we could go with kind of like navy blue and like pops of gold or yellow. So that's kind of like my plan for today. I went ahead and grabbed kind of like a medium size-ish little linen canvas board. So these ones are from Ruben, and these are the ones that I like to use mostly with my paint markers. I don't really have to like prep a canvas. I don't have to worry about like paper warping or anything like that. And I find that the markers and just like I guess like any of the acrylic paint markers that I've used usually glide pretty well on the surface. So I ended up picking one that's more of like a landscape kind of format rather than the typical square that I've been using in the past. I thought I didn't have like any of them left over, so I could have done Auroron? Yes, Auroron next time, because I finally found some extra boards that I could definitely use, and we can add to those previous little portraits that I did of some of the Natling characters, and we'll kind of like mix and match markers at that time. But let's focus on what we are working on right now. So I went ahead and grabbed my Pilot Color Eno in the color red, and I'm doing my sketch. So I like using a colored lead typically when working on these kinds of marker videos, just because it's a little bit cleaner compared to using just pure graphite or this normal graphite, because the loose graphite or anything that's like on this canvas board gets picked up quite easily. Even while I was working kind of with the paint markers a little bit later, my whole side of my right hand was getting smudged with red, and that's because of the red lead that's currently being placed on top of the canvas. It just moves around quite easily, so it's easier for me to work with a color that will blend with the markers a little bit more subtly. If not, they won't appear at all, rather than accidentally muddying up some of my lighter colors by using the actual kind of like darker gray kind of typical graphite that you're used to. If I knew I had more of like a cooler toned kind of piece, or I wasn't too worried about accidentally mixing blue into the skin tone or anything like that, I would choose either the photo blue or like the kind of darker bluish purple that I typically use in my sketchbook as well. But red is usually the safer option, especially because when I work with like skin tones, the red kind of like just gives it slightly more of a warmer touch if it just happens to blend. So here's my sketch of Anaxa. It's basically based off of the one that was in the top right hand corner of my sketchbook, because I thought the angle was kind of nice for a horizontal kind of landscape formatting. I was kind of juggling the idea if I wanted to do more of like a vertical format, but I think for now the horizontal kind of works for what I wanted, and it didn't feel too claustrophobic in terms of wanting to put like a face and including a little bit more of like background compared to the ones that I did for, I guess, Mualani, Kinich, and Gachina, where it was just basically just portrait focused and then having a lot of white space around the characters. So color-wise, I did do a few swatches in my sketchbook, which you saw a little bit earlier, of me planning out just the generic color palette, but I didn't really have an idea for like lighting or the actual colors for the entire piece. So just to play it on the safer side and to give myself a good range of what I wanted for the colors potentially, I decided to block in our background first. So I think initially when I was blocking in the section that was closest to Anaxa's kind of like hair, it was kind of really dark initially, but then you can see that occasionally I'll go back and do a layer or two over it, and it got kind of lighter. So if your marker is not like well mixed, and this is gonna happen probably regardless, even if you shake the marker prior to using it, because there's gonna be some separation probably from where the nib is lying and in between, I guess, like the nib and the barrel, because typically if you have to shake a paint marker, there is like a little metal ball that's kind of like mixing the paint that's like within the barrel, but anything outside of the barrel is probably going to separate as well. So when I was using the marker initially, I had some separation, and I find that a lot of the separation tends to make the pigment of the paint a little bit more vibrant as well as just darker. So even here, when I was using this like peachy color for the shadow of underneath Anaxa's chin, it came out much more orangey rather than more of a pastel orange, like it became a little bit more at the top of his head. And later on, when I start to fill in the shadow on the right side of his face, it's going to become a little bit lighter. So if you ever see that kind of discrepancy, it's nice to have like a scrap piece of paper and just kind of blot some of that paint out and mix it up after shaking your pen again. I didn't really have any separation issues when using using the red. The red was super matte, nice and flat, so that was like really easy to work with. But some of the darker colors tend to have a little bit more streakiness, and similar to like some of the lighter colors, let's say our peach tones, the base color that I used for his face had a little bit more of like a transparent look, and I usually relate that as well as to how much the marker is mixed up. And yeah, so just small things to keep in mind when working with just acrylic markers in general, especially if they have a lot of like loose paint floating around rather than, let's say, their felt tip versions where it doesn't require you to activate the pen. But kind of like in terms of process, I ended up blocking in a lot of the flowers right away, and you might see that there might be some like little white gaps. I was scared I was going to lose a lot of the form of the flowers, which I will in the end because I was not too sure how exactly I wanted to paint the flowers in, but I left the white gaps just in case if I wanted to separate some of the folds of the petals or keeping the petals separate from one another, so giving myself a little bit of indication just in case if I wanted to cover that up with a darker line art, or if I will shade kind of to fill in between two sections and then closing up that white gap. But after that, I ended up doing the leaves and we started to work a little bit more on his face and then as well as the clothing. So this blue marker for some reason was also separating a lot as well, so I ended up just shaking it, using it a bunch, and then as we started doing our second layer, it became much more lighter. It's still a little bit streaky here and there, but I don't really mind. Part of it might be also the canvas because it doesn't really absorb the paint per se. It might work a little bit better on like mixed media paper where the paper can kind of absorb the paint a little bit more rather than me swirling it around on the canvas too much. It's probably hard to see due to just the angle as well as like me not showing any close-ups at this point, but this kind of like linen canvas board does have a little bit of like that crosshair kind of texture of a canvas, so it's very uniform, but sometimes you do get like small white gaps here and there if you're not laying down your paint very evenly, or if it's like a medium that requires you to press down harder to fill in gaps, or if you need to like, I don't know, just make sure to hit every little white spot if you want like some smooth kind of finish on top of like, your coloring, if that makes sense. So whenever I use like these types of markers, I tend to go with a more cell shaded type of look. Oftentimes, if I have the ability to kind of mess around with the pressure sensitivity, I guess that's more of a digital term, but like being able to control the amount of pressure that you're using with your medium. This works the best mostly with like dry mediums. I like having a much smoother surface, or if I'm using watercolors where I have the ability to blend more at ease by using like transparencies or diluting the paint and stuff, then I like a softer look. But for me, I know I'm not super confident in doing like blending either using another tool or my finger with acrylic paint, so I felt a little bit more comfortable doing cell shading, and typically I like the look of the bolder colors alongside probably a thicker, darker kind of line work that we're going to do at the very end, hopefully tie everything together. So I always associate Anaxa kind of with this color scheme, even though I know his hair is much more of a lighter kind of yellowy tone compared to the kind of like seafoam green that I tend to lean him towards, just because it's a color that I just for some reason associate him with. I don't know if it's because it's kind of like the in-between his hair color and the turquoise blue-ish color that he has on his lapel on his collar, so I kind of just mixed the two. Also, I think like wind characters often fit this kind of aesthetic too, at least like the seafoam green color, so it's just my own bias kind of showing here. But because of that, I did end up blocking in his hair kind of with this greenish color, and then we'll pull out some lighter colors to kind of knock back the color to not be so bluish green, and we'll kind of lean it towards a little bit more of a yellowy green, lightening it up kind of like where the light source would be, and then adding some shadows to where I wanted my darker colors to be. Gloves, I ended up working a little bit backwards. So another thing that I kind of struggle with when it comes to painting with something that's more opaque, so mediums like acrylic paint, oil painting, I tend to have a harder time being able to grasp either working with majorities like midtones and darker colors and then pulling out your highlights rather than working with something like, I guess, like colored pencils or dry mediums where you slowly build up your values, as well as watercolors where I tend to preserve a lot of my lighter colors really early on and then building up your darker colors as you build up more layers. So my brain works from light to dark, but a lot of these mediums require you, or they don't really require you. It's just easier to work, I guess, in a way from working from dark to light sometimes. So when I was working on his gloves or some of the dark areas where it had a lot of black, I was going to rely a lot on pulling out mid-tone colors and my highlights to go over the black and just hope that the paint markers were opaque enough that we don't show too much of the darker color underneath. So sometimes if my paint marker is separating, or if I didn't mix it up enough, or if the marker is just a little bit more translucent and requires you to build up more layers, then you might have some of the mid-tone colors, darker colors kind of poking through. So I do recommend if you want something that's super bright, super opaque, you might have to do like a few layers over and over again. Like I said, some of the mid-tone colors I feel like have pretty good opacity as well as just like nice smooth coverage, but some of the darker colors do come out a little bit more streaky. And then some of the lighter colors also require just a few more layers to make sure that you get rid of the streakiness. But like I mentioned, it could be just the canvas board surface that I'm using because I'm pushing around the paint a lot more because it's not absorbing as quickly and it kind of just sits on the surface. So that could be also just user error on my part. But I had a lot of fun working on this piece. I do think it would be fun if I could do like a watercolor version of this so we can play around with deepening some of the values and giving it more of a subtle look. Oh, also, careful. So even though they give you like a protective cap, there is still a little bit like of unpredictability in terms of using these kinds of paint markers. I've had this happen with my previous set as well, but I accidentally loosened the tip of the brush marker thing, kind of like at the tip of it, where accidentally when I was shaking, it started to like really spew out a lot of the paint. But for this one, I guess it was just seeping out from the nib itself. So as soon as I uncapped it after shaking it to make sure that I could have a slightly more even application, it started to really drip and dripped on top of my canvas. I moved it towards like my sketchbook so it could drip over there, just cleaned it up a little bit. But luckily I was able to wipe a good majority of the paint off of the canvas because like I said, this one doesn't really absorb the paint super quickly. And the paint is opaque, so I was able to clean up his face at least. For some reason, I forgot to clean up the rest of his hair. It kind of just merged with his collar lapel area, so I noticed that a little bit later, but I ended up not fixing it regardless. So back to the flowers, I was not sure how exactly I wanted to do this. I wasn't sure if I wanted to add the shadows to be super dark or if I just wanted to add another color to just help separate the petals from one another before I added line art. So I ended up using kind of like a soft maroony. Is this like a maroon? Not really. It's kind of a mauve-ish color. So I ended up doing that for our shadows, or at least kind of to add a little bit of difference to our red petals, his earring. I ended up putting a little bit of a highlight for his eyes. Now, I accidentally changed his expression while adding in and blocking in our colors, so it's not going to be exactly how I wanted it to be, and it's not as similar to what I initially sketched out. But overall, I think it was still kind of fun, which is kind of why, like, in the future, if I end up doing a traditional stream or a video, I would like to do kind of like a redemption and just do watercolor. One, I am itching to do watercolor so badly right now, but also I just really want to paint with watercolor again and just play around with the colors, because this kind of color scheme for Anaxa I think could be very fun, and we could bleed in maybe more of the reds and the blues together, add in more of like the greens into some of our darker areas, and kind of like vice versa. And I think it could be just like a fun time. So I will see when I'm able to do either a video or another stream this time, and I'll be able to work on traditional art because I think that could be fun. And I am going to be taking a slight step back from doing art fight just because I went ham. Well, for me, it's like considered going ham. I did one illustration or drawing per day for Art Fight for the last, I think, 10 days? I think I've done 10. Actually, let me go check. Yes, okay, it was 11. So I ended up doing 11 illustrations for the last 11 days in July. So because of that, it just gives me a lot less time to work on other things. So I'm going to take a step back and just like casually work on different pieces. I'm going to go back and work on more attacks first after finishing up one more revenge, and I'm just going to take everything slow. So even though I'm having a lot with art, like a lot of fun with this year's Art Fight, I just need to take a little bit of a break and slow down so that I can put more focus on videos, personal artwork, as well as just like not being cooped up, just doing a bunch of drawings for several hours a day. So I think it would be just a good time to take a break. But in terms of process and progress on the piece, I switched over to our black so that we could do line art. So from other pieces, I've always juggled between using a different color alongside with black to do our line art. But because I wanted things to really pop, I just stuck with using the black. So I mentioned very early on when I was doing the color swatches that there was a lot of blues and purples, but I kind of wished there was a slightly more bigger gap in between of like the values of our blues and purples. So there's some that look very similar, so I wish there was maybe one that was a little bit on the darker side for both blue and purple, and maybe one that's a little bit on the lighter side to fill in our value scale a little bit more. Because some of them are like subtly a little bit warmer, and then some are like just a bit cooler, but they're like relatively in the same value range. So if I use let's say a dark blue in this case, and I wanted to have like a dark blue line art as well, there's not really a blue that really could stand out from it, so I would have to use black if I really wanted to have like a dark, crisp line art. And I ended up just doing that for the entirety of Anaxa here, and I do like what it looks like. Don't get me wrong, but I would have liked some areas where it was a little bit more subtle. I could have just used some of the blue in his hair and it would have worked perfectly. I don't know. But I also don't have the best application here. The other times when I did the line art for Kinich and Mualani, I think I had an opportunity to get a little bit more of like thinner, sharper lines. My hand was a little bit shaky today, as well as I was dragging my hand across my canvas rather than letting my arm kind of flow through to get more of like a smoother line art. So we got a little bit of shakiness, inconsistency in terms of like the line width, so it's not exactly the best. But hopefully you can kind of see how sharp these lines can get and how thin they can get if you actually have like a proper application with them. But after that, I did a little bit of cleanup. I added some gold because the set does come with a nice gold and silver kind of like metallic pen, which I think is very pretty when it catches the light. So I added it to some of his gold accents here and there. And I think we are done with his piece. There are some areas that definitely need sprucing up, but I think I'm just going to leave it for today because I just had a lot of fun working on the piece rather than trying to make something that looks super, super polished, I guess. But let me know if you guys want to see more acrylic painting videos with any of these markers. I think in the future I will do like a combination of using all the markers that I do have together, because some markers I think have better application on certain surfaces or just like for certain purposes. Like these particular Simptap markers are great for filling in larger areas, but I like using them for line art just because they do have that versatility in terms of using the thicker and the thin lines. But thank you again to Arrtx for sending me these markers to try out. I always love the Simptap markers and they're always a blast to use. So hopefully you guys will also check them out if you're interested in adding more acrylic markers to any of the sets that you may have owned, or maybe they're your first set. But I'll talk to you guys next time in the next video. Bye!